Yeah. Okay, I will start. Great.
Okay, welcome to everyone on this talk about a conversation about climate reporting. So it seems like in these times and days, it's a bit of a luxury to talk about that. But at the same time, if we know what's ahead of us or what's actually already happening in environment around us, it's quite a really important topic to cover, and in journalism as well as on this festival. So today I'm joined by Catherine Dunn. She's a content editor of Oxford Climate Journalism Network, and in a few minutes she's gonna tell us something about this network, and then we're gonna have a conversation with her about the climate reporting. And on my left side I have Klara Širovnik from Večer magazine. This is a Slovenian magazine, and she's a really young and engaged journalist who usually covers culture as well as social issues. She did a lot of really good pieces on different social issues things, and she's part of this network, so she's gonna share her experience with joining the network as well today, and about how she got and when she realized that climate reporting is an important thing, maybe in the future and even now already. So Catherine, if you are ready, if you don't mind, I'm inviting you to present us the Oxford Climate Journalism Network and what you do.
Hey, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here to your lovely country and giving me an excuse to get out of my kitchen where I've spent the last 2 years reporting and writing like so many of you, I'm sure. It wasn't what we sign up to be journalists to do, but happily now there's the chance to meet people in person. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about this network, because I think it's probably the first of its kind really in the world. And then I'll take you through some little statistics that the Reuters Institute has done, because we're also a research institute. I'm not in the research team, but we have loads of research about how audiences react to climate change reporting, climate change coverage, some little things to think about, and then hopefully we will actually discuss the solutions, the three of us, once you are kind of thoroughly overwhelmed by the challenges we face. So, can I press the button now? There we go, there it is. There you have it. Okay, so this network, I'm part of a team, of course. I just joined in January, but this network was announced last year. It's funded by the European Climate Foundation, and the genesis of it comes from the deputy director, Mira Selva, who's a very senior veteran journalist who now runs our fellowship programs, and Wolfgang Blau, who was a visiting fellow at the center, but he is also the ex-president of Condé Nast International, which of course is a huge magazine publishing company. So it came out of these discussions on what climate change looks like now, some research that Wolfgang was doing, talking to climate reporters and editors around the world, and what it would look like for climate to really be integrated into newsrooms. And of course, in this network, we don't tell journalists how to do their jobs. We think they already know how to be journalists, but one of the founding ideas here is that climate change is such a huge systemic change that it's going to change everything about our lives. And this isn't something that should just be for the science reporters or the climate reporters, which of course not every newsroom has. This is something that is going to be transforming the lifestyle desk, fashion reporters, sports, economics, politics, business, of course. So that's kind of the founding idea. There's 4 parts. The kind of pointy end of the spear is this course for working journalists around the world. We admit 100 people every 6 months, so we'll have 200 journalists go through the course this year, and they're from all around the world. Klara is one, of course. And it's sort of like a university course. Every 2 weeks, we have a seminar with kind of usually a very well-known climate change expert, scientist, policymaker of some kind. We have reading groups, we have fireside chats, which, I think it was last week we talked about energy and the war in Ukraine. The week before that, we talked about elections and climate change with reporters, from Brazil and Bangladesh, all talking about how it was affecting politics in their country. We also have kind of 3 other elements to this that are part of what the Institute already does. So we have leadership programs for newsroom leaders about how they can integrate climate. We have fellowships, which we already do, but these will be kind of climate-targeted fellowships. And we have original academic research. So we're going to have a researcher joining us, because we'll see kind of from some of the research we have, at the moment we have more questions than answers. So this is to start getting some real answers about how climate journalism works at a systemic level. You can see, this is the cohort. You can see there is kind of an emphasis on newspaper reporters, but we have photojournalists, we have general assignment editors, we have graphics editors, we have people from all different parts of the world of journalism. It's not about getting the most senior person in the newsroom, it's not about getting the most experienced or the person who's been covering climate change for 20 years. It's a real mix. And that's also about the international focus. You can see, 25 members from Africa, big newsrooms, small newsrooms, another 20 from Asia. There are a lot of people from Europe in the program, but it's about having a really big mix of people who, people from the BBC and AFP, but also people who are in really small newsrooms, some of whom have been covering climate and the environment for years. This is kind of an example of, I think, our first session, I believe. It's a very kind of now famous climate scientist working on attribution science, which is kind of an emerging field. So, this is my favorite chart, because if you know journalists, this will tell a story that is very relatable, which is that everybody thinks their own coverage of climate change is okay or good, and people tend to think everybody else's coverage of climate change is bad. So this is kind of the system we're going in with. Some of these blind spots and how people tend to think they're doing a good job and everybody else is the problem. But to go into some of the kind of the challenges, I know from being a climate and an energy reporter, one of the big challenges is how much does your audience actually care? Of course, we have metrics for this, but when we're judging, should we devote resources to this? Our audience is interested. We do have data on this. I believe this is from 2020. It's kind of hard to see here. But in general, you can see across these, I think, 52 markets, in general, people do care. They think it's very or extremely serious, usually more than half of the people surveyed. And the proportion, I'm very sorry that Slovenia isn't part of this group. So we have to kind of try and fill in the gaps. But also, as we see here, the countries where people seem to care the most about climate change, Chile, Kenya, South Africa, people are really, really feeling the effects in an immediate way. And then down there at the bottom, countries like the Netherlands or Sweden, which we associate with having quite progressive climate change policies. But I think this suggests that it's really a misnomer that climate change is a question of the elite, a question of, a luxury that people can address only when they have money. Because we see from newsrooms there, we see from reporters there, that this is something really, really immediate. The question of drought, if you were a reporter in South Africa, and the question of coal and whether or not you should eliminate it is a really immediate question that reporters are covering all the time. So since we don't have Slovenia, I took some neighboring countries, plus Slovakia, my apologies. And we can see here, there's a huge range, but I think we could guess that probably at least half of the market you guys are looking at probably do think that climate change is extremely or very serious. People do care. But how much do they care is kind of a mixed bag. It's a polarizing topic. So everybody knows probably that the US is politically polarized. You'd have to tell me kind of where you think Slovenia fits on the spectrum. But we can see, probably not surprisingly, that people on the left, in general, tend to be more concerned about climate change, and people on the right, in general, tend to be less concerned about climate change. So we can see that climate change is one of these political flag points, really, that people associate with politics. We can also see that how seriously people take climate change depends country to country on how much they're sharing news. So it could be the case if you're in Chile, where the majority think it's very serious, the majority is also the people who are sharing the most. But it could be the case that you're in Sweden, where still the majority of people think it's important, but less so, where the minority is kind of the loudest group sharing that they don't think climate change is serious. And you can see in the US too, you have a real polarization. And obviously you can see too that if people tend to think that climate change is serious, they think coverage is pretty good. And if they don't think climate change is serious, they tend to think coverage is pretty bad. So these are the kind of things that we're up against. Obviously you can see there's TV. People are tending to get climate change news from TV, and there's a huge age split, as there is in kind of every market, in terms of older people are getting their news more from TV, and younger people are getting it from alternative sources. So another thing that climate change reporters are talking about all the time is the issue of news avoidance. This research, it's a little bit old now, it's from 2017, and we can kind of guess that maybe things have changed a little bit since then with the pandemic, the highs and lows of how much people want to cover the news or how much people want to pay attention. But we think that 29% of people across all these markets regularly avoid the news. And I mean, you can see kind of a mix across loads of these countries. But the biggest reasons, maybe they will make sense to you when you think about why you haven't clicked on a climate change story recently. Makes you feel bad. You're not sure it's true. Don't think there's anything I can do about it. It leads to arguments. It disturbs my ability to concentrate, and it consumes too much of my time. So the issues that we hear about climate change coverage, not only perceptions from readers and the audience, but also from the editors who are deciding whether or not to assign these stories, that it's boring, that it's technical, and that it's depressing. Okay. And then there's the question of impartiality and neutrality, which is also the question, of if you as a journalist think that climate change is a fact and you should move on from there, what does your audience expect from you? And obviously it'll be different kind of at the outlet you're at, but we still see that audiences expect and want a certain level of neutrality and a certain level of objectivity and all sides to be presented. There's an age split here as well, that younger people tend to think there's certain things that aren't worth debating or pretending to be neutral on, and climate change tends to be one of those things. But this is something that if you ask kind of the average person, do you think each side should, and then the reader or the audience can make up for themselves, they tend to say yes. But if you question them a little bit more, then there tends to be this gray area. Okay, what about climate change? Should you have a climate change denier sitting on a stage with a climate scientist in 2022? Is that false equivalence, or is that presenting the views of different people? And finally, misinformation, which we know is an issue, but is maybe not as big of an issue as vaccine misinformation, as misinformation about politics, celebrities, that kind of thing. And that's probably a question too of, in your individual country, how common is outright climate denial, which is what people are going to kind of most actively identify as misinformation. So those are a few things that climate reporters are up against. Questions of bias versus activism, news avoidance, impartiality, and I don't know, what else? Boredom. But hopefully we can talk about the solutions and we can get into kind of what this network is here to do. So, yes.
Thank you for this great presentation. So now we know what we're gonna be talking about and trying to discover in this conversation now. But first, I would just like to invite Clara to share her thoughts on the network as a member of the network. And maybe the first question I have for you is like, as I said, you usually don't. Like, I'm a science journalist, so like it's expected that eventually I'm going to write a story also, or make. I did already do some radio shows on climate change, but for you, you come from a different kind of area of journalism. And when did you realize that you will probably have to cover also climate stories, or that in your stories you're going to have a climate change angle to them?
Okay, I just want to get one thing out of the way first, so my imposter syndrome doesn't kill me in the next hour. In my newspaper, so in Večer, we have lots of great science and ecological journalists. Some of them are sitting here, so I'm a little bit ashamed now, because it's really a good luck, and maybe not just a good luck, but also a great recommendation letter from my editor, which got me into this program. But to answer your question, I'm following this international journalistic network. You guys probably know it. For the last 6 years, ever since I started studying journalism. And the topics that this organization highlights as important have changed dramatically in the last 2 years, I feel. First, when I started observing it, the most important topic was human conflict, then refugee flows. And now, in the last 2 years, all the opportunities you can take, for example, in co-financed projects or in some sorts of project happening around the globe, are related to climate change. So in that matter, I felt outdated and old. And I believe I'm none of those things, right? So I knew there has to be something that I can do. And in this same platform, I noticed that Reuters and Oxford are giving lessons for free, which is, of course, another great thing about it, because smaller newsrooms naturally can't afford to pay loads of money for their journalists to go someplace and educate themselves. And yes, this was this is a little bit a banal explanation of how I got into this, and not very natural. Maybe I should observe my surroundings a little bit more, but to tell the truth, yes, this was it. I wanted to have more opportunities in this sphere.
That makes sense somehow. And even like I checked your work, like latest work basically, and even now I noticed that since I guess you joined the network, you already started with some climate content and environmental content.
Yes, we've been covering climate extensively even before, but I was not that involved because I was covering different topics. So one of the main one of the main things to take from this network is that you try to integrate the lessons that you've learned into your newsrooms. And I was wondering how to do that, so I asked our editor of the Sunday supplement to give me a little corner in the Sunday magazine, and there was no problem. So we started Zemlin List, like a little ecological corner in our newspaper for the Sundays, right?
Yeah, I think that's great. One way of doing things. And I'm just going to go a step back before we go to the solutions and to actually talk about climate reporting, which is, Catherine, before you joined Oxford Climate Journalism Network, you worked as a journalist covering energy for different newspaper outlets mostly. And how did you get into reporting on energy commodities and also in relation to climate change?
Yeah, I think it was also, well, in a way it's similar, because I also wanted more opportunities. This is why I became a business journalist. I'm Canadian. There weren't a huge amount of journalism jobs after the financial crisis. I thought it would be easier to get a journalism job if I was on a business desk, and I wasn't wrong. But I got into it originally from covering kind of agricultural commodities at the Wall Street Journal. And I found this fascinating, the way, the sort of jargon that business and markets was shrouded in that made it seem complicated or confusing or intimidating for a lot of people, especially after the financial crisis, when everybody had a stake in understanding how financial systems work and how global trade works. But then from commodities, I priced oil, and this was a very kind of technical job that I wasn't really suited to, but it gave me a kind of ground eye view of how energy and oil moves around the world. And then obviously when I went to Fortune, which is where I was recently, then it was a moment to kind of integrate covering finance, markets, covering oil, and covering climate change, which of course I cared about. And of course I wanted a chance to reconcile this cognitive dissonance that I know so many people live with, where you're covering one thing, but you want to have a chance to address this head on and feel like you're kind of doing your part, feel like you're talking about it. Yeah, and that's kind of this is an extension of that. It's a chance to look at climate change head on, talk about how newsrooms operate and structure, because of course I've been in loads of newsrooms myself and I see the limitations of your power there, depending on who your boss is or the system that you're in. And you really need, for something like climate change journalism, you really do need champions at the top. So this is kind of what I hope comes out of this a little bit.
Okay, so let's now go to the possible solutions in regard to, I don't know, I don't think we're going to find them today. I think there is a lot of questions that are unanswered, but we can try. So you mentioned in your presentation that when there are communities or people, groups of people who take climate change as a serious threat to humans and environment and the whole planet, basically, those are the people the audiences that find our content that's about climate change, and they think that the reporting is good and that there is, I don't know, I guess enough of it. Maybe I'm drawing too many connections together, but you also said that there are people who think it's not serious, and they also say there is, I don't know, I guess they see this reporting as unimportant or not good. So how can we, because I guess the goal would be, at least for me, to also reach these communities that might now think that it's not a serious threat. So, and maybe they even actively avoid news about climate change. So how to fight this news avoidance in specific audiences?
Yeah, and I would say one thing we don't really know is the question too, is if the people who do take climate change really seriously and do care a lot, whether or not they're actually reading and consuming a lot of news on climate change. And this, I think, is where the news avoidance question comes in. And the question of, if you click that link on the IPCC report, are you going to go away depressed and sad and unable to sleep? You knew it was bad already, and now you really know it's bad, right? The question of, for people who are more skeptical or in between, I think I was saying there's some climate researchers that say if somebody is, if they don't believe in climate change, that's their position 100%, you should move on. It's more the people where you can find ways to make this conversation feel relevant to them, make this conversation not feel like something that's happening somewhere else. I think this is the job of good journalism, is to convey the way that something is immediate, convey the way that it's something that is personal. It's also the question here too of this idea sometimes put forth obviously by some political elites, that the idea of caring what happens to the environment, caring about the natural world, is somehow an elitist pursuit. And of course, it is not. It's the people who are the most vulnerable already to things like food shocks who are being hit the hardest by climate change. This is a question of climate justice. And I was saying some of the journalists we talk to that are in our network, or that I talk to in other ways, they talk about the way that they're interacting with the people that they're reporting on. Maybe they're from that community. And it may not be about talking in the language of kind of high summitry, as my boss Miraselva puts it, where heads of state go to Glasgow and they go to COP26 and they make big speeches. This doesn't feel immediate to people. They know that their landscape is changing. They know it's harder to make a living. They know it's harder to depend on the harvests and the seasons the way it was before. This is something very immediate, but sometimes I think you have to be a little bit flexible on the language that you use in order to open up conversations in ways that feel relevant to people and not assume the worst of people too. Like I was saying, I'm from an oil region. I'm from a region where sometimes just saying the words climate change can suck the air out of the room. And it would be easy to assume coming from London that this means people don't care. But of course you are hitting something about the way people have spent their lives, their careers, what is important to them, the importance of energy. And it is also about recognizing the person in front of you and finding a way to move that conversation forward. Because if that conversation isn't moving forward, it's sort of like you can be perfect or you can have the conversation. And I think as a journalist, your job is, it's to convey the reality, but it's also to keep the conversation moving forward in a way that doesn't alienate or dehumanize or take away the dignity of the people that you're talking to, even if you don't agree with them. So that's something I would say. Sometimes being flexible in the language can be a powerful tool for meeting people where they are.
And I guess what your network aims towards is also to include a diverse range of journalists. So exactly not just like I see myself sometimes as a science journalist quite away from the real life, basically. I have the luxury to just report on I don't know, some strange animal behaviors or stuff. That's like not lots of people can relate to that. But I think here it's important that we are not just, and when I do science journalism, I think like I do it for a specific audience that follows science stories and things like that. But I think with climate, we need to broaden these stories and broaden the range of journalists that do involve the climate take on the specific story. Like, let's say there is a sports reporting or something else. And I think this is like one of the big things you stand for. I mean, the
I would
network.
say that I think some of the stories people love the most are stories about animals. So you should definitely not stop doing. I feel like sometimes when we won't read a story about a human, we will definitely read a story about an animal, and the weirder they're behaving, the better. But yeah, I think we see this definitely, and we see this in the network, and in a way it is a little bit dependent on kind of the personal drive and how enterprising that reporter is themselves. But we see reporters who, Habi doesn't mind, me talking about this, but, we have a sports reporter in Germany, and of course he is finding ways to talk about how the Alpine Association in Germany has been very forward-thinking and very open about talking about climate change, because of course the people in the Alpine Association love to go hiking in the mountains, and they see for themselves the way the seasons are changing kind of month to month. So yeah, I think this is something, or, I know fashion reporters who are talking to a huge extent about cotton, and the environmental costs of fast fashion or how companies should change. I think there's a climate angle on everything, but I think we said sometimes maybe it's also not, the climate angle is not always going to be the top thing. And that's kind of okay. Sometimes it's about the story being about something else. And a few lines down, there is, it's also connected to climate change. There's also this other factor going on. It doesn't always have to be this extreme. But yeah, we see that across all beats, I think.
Do you have any experience with
yeah,
that kind
this was probably the most important realization to get from this network, because I was a little intimidated also at the beginning of the lessons, but also before I joined, because I always felt like I'm not a scientist, I'm not equipped in that matter, right? But then I started to realize that not a lot of journalists are also scientists, and not a lot of scientists are journalists, right? You are an excellent addition to our Zich here, but this is not very, it doesn't happen much. So the important thing is to be equipped at least a little bit So you can recognize this component in all the stories you meet across the way, right? In arts, for example, we were just talking yesterday that a few weeks back there was a contemporary photographic exhibition about glaciers, right, in the Alps, Slovenian Alps. This was a great opportunity to cover arts on one hand and climate change on the other.
Yeah, I guess we have a lot of this lately, even in the popular culture, when we get songs about climate change, we get movies about climate change, or like, and so on. And there is an interesting thing that we got to when we were preparing for this conversation today that I want to mention, because I think it relates to the previous question. It's that if there is a natural disaster or something happens, then we talk about climate change like really heavily all of a sudden. And I guess this might not be the best way of doing it, especially because then you do get people to be like really like feel like they cannot do anything about it, as well as just feeling really helpless about the whole situation. And maybe how can we improve that with including the climate into really daily reporting, even if it's not about a disaster, or any other ideas, but not have it as a super technical topic and just about disasters?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think I was thinking about this idea that in a way with climate change, there's always something. Okay, we know the IPCC is telling us code red, things are really bad, things are going to get worse, but there's always some more immediate crisis. It was the pandemic, and now it's Ukraine, of course, and then climate change will come to the fore every time we have a disaster. And yeah, there is the question too of, well, there are all kinds of ethical questions about how you cover disasters and how you interact with and talk to people who have recovered from disasters, and how you cover the aftermath of what's happening there. But I do think it also starts to get into this kind of controversial question of solutions journalism, and whether or not that works or not, and whether or not that is kind of a middle ground that helps people feel that there is progress being made, feel that there are solutions, feel that people are doing things in their communities. Sometimes climate reporters will say, you know, this is sugarcoating, it's trying to make a bad situation upbeat, it's not really how it is. But when you're confronting real questions about news avoidance, and you're trying to get people also maybe in a way aware of the facts, but a little bit desensitized to reading about climate change. So it's not every time you go, it's about a mass extinction. It's a horror click at best. This is a question. This is something that I kind of wonder whether or not we will have a bit more success with. Of course, I'm also skeptical, because I also sometimes see things that are like, this tote bag will save the planet, and I'm like, that's not what's going to happen, and you shouldn't tell people that's not true. But yeah, this is really a question. I think we're talking about like also local stories, also things that feel immediate to people, things that people in their communities are doing, ways that people in their communities are affected, not just during a disaster. We were talking about in Slovenia, the biodiversity is also, okay, it's a little bit different than just temperature rise, but it's all connected, and this is part of, you know, a big conversation that I think people are interested in having.
Yeah, I mean, it showed last year even in Slovenia, because of what I want to get to now, it's basically this idea of individual versus collective responsibility when it comes to climate change. And the question is more about like, who is our audience? As a journalist, we have some audience, and like whether we are talking about collective responsibility, I guess our audience are more like policymakers and politicians and that kind of area. But if we think about individual responsibility, it's just all the publics we can talk to, basically all the different communities. And I have a lot of like unanswered questions about how to deal with like when we had a pandemic now in these 2 years, it was all at the end, eventually it got in Europe and also in the States, it got to a point where everything became an individual responsibility. there was no collective responsibility to mitigate the spread, to stop or at least slower the spread of the virus. And I guess in climate change, we have a similar situation where big oil companies started with this approach to climate change even like decades ago when they introduced individuals' carbon footprint, which is still a big thing, basically, that like each individual is going to change their way of living, and that's going to improve the situation. It does a little bit, it does help, but we do need big structural policy changes. And how can we balance with this aspect? So talking to individuals, talking to individual communities, bringing these topics up, versus also showing that there is a collective responsibility from our governments or policymakers when it comes to this.
Yeah, it's a super good question. I think about this every time I see or indeed have written a piece that's like 5 things you can do to save the planet with like a little like, oh no, that's not really how it works. Like, it's about eliminating coal, but okay. The hard thing about climate change is it is a systemic, collective effort, like, to the most extreme extent that we as a civilization have ever faced. So there's no denying, and I don't think in that element it shouldn't be sugarcoated to people, that this is about systemic change. This is not really about you as an individual using a tote bag or not. At the same time, one thing I think that is worth conveying to people, and when I was a business reporter, I saw this, how people spend their money is part of a huge systemic. How people vote and how people spend their money is something that can influence like huge systemic change. And I think this is worth conveying to people, because the way that businesses have changed their habits, or at least had to feel like they were changing their habits, and the way that those changes have been passed all the way down the line to shipping companies and to energy companies, that is the result of changing consumer habits and consumer pressure. It's the result of pension funds and investors, but it's also the result of everyday people saying, we want more plant-based foods, we want our packaging to be recycling, we want our recycling system to work. These things, I think, do make a difference. It's always going to be a question of whether or not the difference is high enough, but I think these things do make a difference, and it's, it's balancing those things about not giving, one kind of simple swap out your cup as the solution, but in saying like, you do have the power to convey your consumer preferences and your voting preferences to the people who have power. And those changes, I think, they do make a difference. You could see COP26, all these executives were there. Okay, do you believe what they said? Were they sincere? That is a question you have to answer for yourself. Were they there at Paris? No, they weren't. They felt they had to be there. They felt they had to show their face. That is a big change.
Yeah, you mentioned voting in this answer, and I'm just going to go to it, because in Slovenia we have this year super election year. We start with a parliamentary election on the 24th of April, and then in the autumn we have local and presidential elections. And I think in the previous election circles, again, I'm not covering politics and general newsroom stuff, there wasn't a big stress on environment or climate change. Maybe some journalists can correct me if they think otherwise. But is there any advice on how to cover this pre-election period, how to include climate change and environmental topics into the conversation, how to press politicians to actually deal with this big topic? I mean, last year we did have this big referendum that had to deal with the water law, and it was basically about the environmental thing, and it showed that Slovenians do care about this stuff. I think this is like one of the outtakes. And now this year, I would like to see, and I think also my peers, especially maybe we're a bit younger generation, we do really care about this climate change, that this would be part of the conversation that we'd have with our politicians in this circle. I'm speaking for myself, of course, but like, is there any advice you could give to journalists how to approach this?
Well, I'm not a political journalist, so I'm also like, okay, have I ever covered a full election? And I would say the way you put it on the agenda is you keep asking them about it. I don't know, every time there's a scrum, every time there's a press conference where your colleagues can see what you were asking, ask them about it. And I think this question too of not just what will be your commitment at the highest level at COP27, but also, yeah, what will you do about biodiversity? What will you do about this plant? What will you do about air pollution? All of these questions. It's a little bit like, how do we get people used to reading about climate change, and how do, they're interested. How do we start writing articles on it, and we put those articles on the front page, and we tweet those articles at a time when people will actually read them. That requires leadership, but I think when it comes to leadership, like you as a journalist, you can ask that question, and that's leadership. You were the ones who can say, I know people my age, I know they care, I know Slovenians care, we've seen the evidence, so it's my job to put this on the agenda and make sure people are having these questions answered. They may not have known how to phrase it themselves, but people do care. They care about their environment,
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I mean, I do have some more questions now. Clara, do you want to add anything to the
Maybe
conversation?
I will just stray back a little bit, if you don't mind. When you were talking about collective responsibility, for example, I have one example that I would say it's a good one. We were covering overpopulation just a few months back, and in this area, it's really clear how Western countries like to push this blame to other parts of the world. For example, we are always blaming overpopulation in Africa and in India, for example, and saying this should stop. And if this stops, climate change will stop. Maybe not stop, but won't progress at that speed. But the evidence doesn't speak that way, right? And what is also very problematic that Catherine mentioned to me yesterday is that some parts of the world are not covered in research enough because there's no funds, which means that when we are covering climate change, okay, we mentioned that we are not in this report, Slovenia, for example, and this seems very unfair to us, but there are some regions in Asia, mostly, and on the islands, for which we have none data at all. So this, I think, it's a good topic maybe to mention.
Yeah, if I could add something there, that is something, as Claire knows, this is something we hear from these members all the time. And, from good journalists in Nigeria or Kenya or in Nepal as well, where they say, I know how to do my job. I know how to be a good journalist. I don't really need people from the West coming here telling me how to write a story. What I need is good, reliable, up-to-date climate data on the region that I am from. I don't need the data to be all of Africa or all of Southern Africa and 5 years late and done by, exclusively by Western researchers. I need somebody from this community who can speak to the drought that we are facing now. And I need data on how much the glaciers have melted, in Nepal and how it's affecting people. And this is really, maybe going into this, I thought misinformation would be one of the biggest problems, but it's really lack of information that is really hindering the ability of journalists in a lot of the world to do their jobs. And there are huge, huge gaps in climate data. And that's something I think too, as journalists, it's something that's worth highlighting, that, colleagues are struggling to cover this just because of a basic lack of research funding, and, lack of access to data that's more readily available in European countries.
Now I lost my train of thought. No, I wanted to say something about the data and the misinformation. Yeah, do you think? I think your slide was quite interesting, because I think you said like the misinformation about vaccines was, I don't know, over 50%. Do you know how 70%, or like it was a really high number?
I think was it like 56 or something?
Yeah, something like that. But then about the climate change, it was around 20%.
Yeah.
So this is probably completely wrong, my thesis, but like
My thesis is probably wrong too. But I have one.
like I don't know. I mean, in Slovenia, I know the vaccine hesitancy was quite low before the pandemic, and then now it's just we have completely polarized about who is vaccinated, who is not, and this topic is not a topic to debate with anyone. But like, do you think that like because the pandemic was like on a big scale in the news every day, we heard about COVID and stuff, do you think that once or when this will happen with the climate change, the misinformation might increase?
Yeah, it's a super good question. Once it becomes about, I personally might be told to do something or have to do something that I don't want to do, or vice versa, will it become this kind of personal feeling of, I'm going to kind of look at the science or deny the science in a way that suits my ability to make my own choices rather than collective action? I think it's a good question. I also, one of the things, I don't know for sure, so I'm also just speculating. I'm wondering too if that number is, in a way, is lower because people are just thinking of misinformation as climate change exists and is caused by humans or not, which, yes, is pretty widespread in some ways and in some countries, but as we can see, the data shows that most people are concerned about it and they care. So now I think the misinformation is becoming almost maybe more sophisticated. A lot of climate researchers think this, that it is moving into new territory where it's politically incorrect in a lot of circles to be an outright climate change denier now. But the way you deal with it, what solutions will work, this is where the misinformation in some ways is becoming more subtle.
Yeah, I mean, one good case of this, I guess, it's like covering electric cars and bringing electric cars in the communities instead of thinking about how to improve public transport or like how to enable people to work more from home. I don't know, in Slovenia, at least this is the case. There was pandemic. We realized, okay, we can work from home. I know work from home, it's not great, and it has its own issues as well because of dealing with workers' rights, with not having life and work balance clearly and things like that. But at the same time, it does mitigate, or like there is less of a carbon footprint you do if you don't travel to work every day, especially in Slovenia, because people tend to live quite far away from, like, let's say, Ljubljana or some bigger cities where they work, and that's a lot of driving basically. And we talk about like, yeah, we will have electric cars, but what about like investing into better public transport schemes and things like that? So it's really a lot of gray areas that I think can really be used to share misinformation, or not really misinformation, but just like not opening debates and not really understanding what the problem is and how to what might be solution.
Yeah, and there's this famous book I think called it's called Manufacturing Doubt. I think Naomi Oreskes, who is an academic from Harvard, and
Merchants of Doubt.
Merchants of Doubt, yeah, and it's very like landmark study in how the funding of, if it wasn't outright misinformation, it was muddying the clarity of information, yeah. And this is hard because of course when you're choosing, okay, should my shirt that I'm going to buy be made out of this, or should it be made out of this? The trade-offs I'm facing as a consumer, they can be difficult. The trade-offs in terms of water use, in terms of pesticides, and in terms of carbon footprint, these can be actually quite complicated decisions to make to understand the whole picture. And with some of these things, too, with energy or policy decisions that are, can legitimately be debated, but the worry is that infusion of doubt that prevents people from making conclusive decisions as policymakers, or moving on with a strategy or developing a strategy. The other thing that's coming out now, of course, is wait, and now there is it's too late, game's over, we're screwed, just give up. And that is also an interesting thing too, where a lot of climate scientists and climate communicators and climate journalists are saying, that's also not true. There is time left. It's a very narrow window, but this idea that the gig is up and you can't do anything anymore, so why even try? This is also inaccurate, and this is also an argument that sometimes you have to ask very carefully, who is pushing this argument? Who is this argument of giving up and not trying convenient for?
Yeah, a few years back, actually, I did a radio show about the psychology of climate change, and this is my last question, and then I'm going to give opportunity to others. This is that thing about how to balance between being helpless about the climate change and feeling like we can't do anything, just being numb and just give up and just say we can't do anything. This is going to happen. It's as it is, and it's a bit of like self-fulfilling prophecy at the end, versus being hopeful into some solutions, and like how to balance that as a journalist, like doing a serious climate reporting, saying that it's a climate crisis, it's not just a climate change, versus and still giving people some hope and some solutions. Do you think about that, or like do you?
Clara, do you have any?
Clara?
Clara. No, I listened. It just I got caught in the part when you said that how to say it. That you call it climate, not just climate change, but for example, we can call it climate crisis, right? It's a big question of terminology. Is this the word? Yes. Because this is what I wonder about a lot, even nowadays when everything is happening with Ukraine, which we cannot call, for example, a conflict, I feel, because it's an attack on a country, right? And I feel it's very similar to climate change in a sense that not everything is relative, right? We should call what is happening as it is, no to sugarcoat it. But yes, of course, there's a danger of feeling hopeless. I have no answer to this, I'm sorry.
I think this is a huge question, and I think it would be very hard to meet any kind of climate change scientist or anybody who thinks about this stuff often and not find that they are grappling with this every day. And you ask yourself too, of course, if you're a journalist, is it your job to tell people action on climate change is necessary? We need to move as fast as possible. What is, some of these statements sound in some context like activism, right? But then also they're a fact, because the alternative is just too horrific to contemplate. And in a way, people need to understand that there is no real alternative to acting on climate change. That's the grim reality. That's what you don't want to scare people with. But how do you find a way to give people hope and give people a sense of movement? I think for me, there would obviously be times in my life where it's like, I said, I'm reading a story about climate change, like through my hands, with this horrible sense of cognitive dissonance. I'm just living my life, and there's a crisis. And in a way, I think an easier thing to do it is to interact with it, is to talk about it all the time. And it's not that the facts aren't scary, but in a way, by talking about it all the time, you can take the sting out of acknowledging it. And I find the more casually you mention it, the easier this gets, in a way. And then you can start to talk about, these are some of the things that are changing. The pace of renewables is really, really incredible. The pace of policy change is really incredible. When I came back from COP26, of course, friends took me aside and said, like, what's going to happen to us? What did you think? I sat there and I heard Greta Thunberg say, this was a failure, it's over. And that is one interpretation. And of course, especially for all of the countries in the world that feel climate change the closest, this was a failure, because there wasn't a really strong acknowledgement of the fact that they're already so vulnerable. There wasn't a historic kind of sense of responsibility for why this has happened. But at the same time, I said, it's not that things are changing. The question is whether or not they will change fast enough. But it's not that things aren't changing. It's not that the energy system isn't transitioning. It's not that companies aren't feeling the pressure. It's not that countries aren't feeling the pressure. They are. The question is just whether or not they are feeling enough of it. and whether or not things are moving fast enough. But we have seen from the pandemic too that enormous, overwhelming change overnight almost. For better or worse, it is possible. I don't know if that's a positive message to take away from it, but maybe things that they thought that people didn't understand or wouldn't grapple with going into the pandemic. In the UK, they didn't think people would stay inside or they would lock down. But when, of course, people understood the depth of the collective challenge that we faced, actually they did. They did stay inside. They did not want to get their grandmother or their friends sick. So I think this is a challenge you're constantly grappling with. But I think I told you Christiana Figueres, who was one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. She's a really great podcast called Outrage and Optimism, and she has a book called The World, and I think it's called The World We Live In. And it starts with a very, very, very scary chapter, and then she kind of moves on and says, like, okay, buck up. We have to keep going. It is a luxury that we do not have to just stop and be helpless. And it's also a luxury that maybe in the West and wealthier countries, we kind of still think we have, but we don't. So this is this is kind of the spirit of buck up and keep going, because that's what we have to do, you know, as journalists and as people.
Okay, thank you. Does any of the in the audience have any questions? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Did you ever experience that conflict between the need for the action about climate change and the pushback with the argument that this is limiting the personal liberties of people? That it's like high on the agenda in the States, like on the right politics, that it's just like not leftist conspiracy, but that the action for the climate change, against climate change, is actually the attack on the liberty of people. How do you deal with this?
Well, I haven't covered it that much, but I think it's happening, and I think actually it will continue to happen, and I think it will only get more intense. And I think also for regions that have been dependent on fossil fuels for their economies, I think this will be a very, very serious question of whether or not people feel their lifestyles are being changed, but also their livelihoods are being taken away. I don't know what the solution is to this. I don't know. It's going to be a question, I think, of how you engender kind of both a sense of urgency and a sense of collective responsibility, which is, as we know, extremely hard. But I think, yes, I think we should prepare ourselves for more of these battles and for them to be more focused on climate change and energy going forward. And I think there will be a lot of challenges in the courts going both ways. We see a lot of challenges in the courts pushing climate forward, and I think we will see a lot going the other way as well. I don't know what the solution is to covering that, but I think, yeah, it's going to get a lot worse in that sense.
Can I just add to it? Maybe, like, I think it's like really important that we see climate change, covering climate change also as a social justice problem. Like, in a sense of what I want to say is that when this green transition is going to happen, because it will have to happen, that we take into account that this will change people's lives, and we still need to take care of these people that will be affected the most, and these communities that will be affected the most, not just by the natural disaster, but also by the job market, and their lives will change. Basically, they might depend on the extraction of oil, and this should stop. It needs to be a green and social transition, not just a green and energy transition, without including the people whose lives will change.
Yeah, I think this raises a just transition, right?
Just.
And this will be, for the region I'm from, is oil dependent, but it'll also be whole countries. You know, it will be Nigeria, and the entire, or Iraq. It'll be, you know, almost the entire national revenue of Iraq. Or Angola, and what will happen to these countries? What will happen to their economies? How will they transition? And also for a lot of these countries, this is, it's a question of not just the power dynamics of the personal freedoms, but it will be a question of climate justice too. Is it okay to consign an entire country kind of to poverty that is previously, living standards were raised on the back of oil and gas revenue?
Do you see me? Hi. So it's not exactly a question, more like an opinion, but I would like to hear your opinion as well. It's about how to get readers' attention about the climate change topics. It's, I think, in Slovenia, it's not. I mean, people are aware of it, and but it's not exactly an issue which you will discuss with your family, with your friends, or people who are interested in it. They will read it, others won't. But there is some other trigger in Slovenia. No matter what topic it is, it's when we have changes that people are feeling in their wallets. And it's happening now. It's happening now with, first because of the coronavirus epidemic, and now because of even further with war in Ukraine, with prices of the gas going up. And it's ironically, it's an opportunity to give people these topics now, because now they are feeling in their wallets. Everybody pays attention, and now it's a good opportunity to give them as many views as possible. So that's why it's important that even as Clara said, even if there are journalists that are not scientists, it's important that we get a lot of different opinions, a lot of different articles to give our readers. So what do you think about that?
Well, I would say I agree, because I'm trained as a business reporter. So, of course, I think talking about money is a great way into many other subjects, and people should use this more. And I think if you do it right, it can be a very nuanced way into this discussion. Of course, there's a lot of conflict too in these areas, and okay, that is also a good story. Before Russia invaded Ukraine, when there was already an energy crisis, right? Prices were already rising. There was already an inflation crisis, and some people were saying this is because of the energy transition. I myself thought it was one factor, and the bigger factor was actually the instability of the seasons, which, like every commodity, underpins the supply and demand of energy. So I personally thought that is the bigger factor here. But I do think, when we were talking to the reporters today, they're saying, every story is about Russia and Ukraine, and my story on the IPCC wasn't published, it was forgotten, the editor wasn't interested. And from my perspective, I said, Russia and Ukraine is a huge energy story, and every energy story is a climate story. So go for it. You don't need to put climate in the headline. It's still a climate story. It's still an energy transition story. Go for it and point out the geopolitics of renewables versus other options, what they're going to cost, price it up for people. It's a legitimate story. And it's another way in. You don't have to brand everything climate for climate to be a factor. It's so big and it's so pervasive, it'll do that itself, So I agree.
Any other questions? Otherwise, this was quite a good final thought, takeaway message, actually. So thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Clara, for joining us today and for this conversation. And I guess we see each other in, half an hour on the next event? Yeah. So thank you also to all of you to come and listen to us.